Welcome to the One Giant Podcast, a sportscaster featured podcast covering all things New York Football Giants. Live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday morning on Sportscaster, bringing balance to the analytics and emotions of covering Big Blue. Here are your hosts, Adam Armbrecht and Andy Makowicz.
And once again, friends, this time on a Monday morning, it's of course OGP, where I'm Adam Armbrecht, joined as always by the healthy, wealthy, and wise Andrew Makowicz. How are we, sir?
Adam, I have a confession to make.
Make it.
This weekend was arguably the best sports weekend for me in probably almost over a year, I'd say. This is almost pre-pandemic levels, how excited I am to talk about what happened over the weekend. Small footnote, Syracuse Orange. In the March Madness NCAA tournament, never bet against the Orange as a double-digit seed in the tourney. That's all I'm going to say.
I heard it went well for you. I checked in on it. It didn't look like a terribly compelling game, so I didn't stick around.
Two games.
Yeah, that's what I wondered. Coming into it, that was my first question was going to be, I know they won, but then I assumed you were going to say, what about the second game? And I was going to say, sorry, I don't watch college basketball. You're going to fill me in. So they won both games then.
Yeah, they played West Virginia last night at 5:00, and you had me pacing around my place, yelling and screaming. And they ended up winning the game by 3 points. So tough matchup. I know you were watching, the B teams, which is those NBA players that happen to play, professionally for a living. But man, March Madness, there's nothing better. I love it.
Yeah, I've always said, if I had the choice between watching, the elite of the elite athletes at the NBA level playing a professional sport versus a collection of guys that, listen, 94% of them aren't even going to sniff the NBA, I always go with the student athletes. I'm knocking it. It's never been my favorite cup of tea, but had I been paying attention, I would have watched the Orange. I watched their first game. I did support you on the first one. I just listened. The schedules, they collide, and I had bigger fish to fry last night as the Nets were on a one-game losing streak. So I had to make sure that I tuned in to see if they handled their business against Washington. Let's not get derailed here. Okay, friends? Thank you for joining us on YouTube. Obviously, fire off your questions during it if you'd like. And if we think that you got something good for us, we'll bring it up in the show as well. We start off in the most important part of it. Of course, we kind of thought that it was all coming down to the wire as far as getting this deal done for one Kenny Golladay. I don't think, and most of the people in the know around the NFL did not anticipate it being the contract that they ended up getting here as the deal got done. 4 years, $72 million for Kenny Golladay. He comes, he stays, he wines, he dines, he slumber parties, and ultimately he becomes a New York Football Giant. Biggest free agent signing for the New York Giants in a number of years. I'm going to exclude Leonard Williams, who was a Giant, right? How big of a deal is this for the Giants to get Kenny Golladay done? And how did you feel when the initial 4 for 72 came across the wire?
Yeah, 4 years, $72 million, $17 million signing bonus. Wouldn't that be nice, Adam? Like you sign a piece of paper, they just hand you $17 million. $40 million guaranteed. It averages out to $18 million a year, obviously. I think, the number came out and it was big. Just based on the way the market has gone for wide receivers this offseason. Corey Davis had the biggest contract but it was kind of a mixed bag because you have guys like Will Fuller signing 1-year deals down in Miami, but then you have guys like Nelson Aguilar getting multi-year deals at $13 million a year. So I didn't know where this contract was going to fall. I thought maybe the market had cooled down enough for the Giants to get him at about $15 million. It ends up being 18. But if you told me going into this offseason that we were going to pay Kenny Golladay $18 million a year on a 4-year deal, I would have signed up for it. That's how crazy things have happened over the last 10 days. It's like people are now, criticizing the deal because of the deal size. To me, I'm glad we got our guy.
Well, and as I said, it's funny because go back to pre-last year. I mean, from afar, everybody, if you listen to the podcast, I love me a big-bodied receiver. I love a big red zone target. I love a guy that can just, throw it up high and let him just dominate over a secondary. So going back to prior to last year, I was on the Golladay train. It was the hip injury, right? And at the age that you get a hip injury, and what does that look like? But as I said all the way along, once he gets in the door, okay, let's, clear up about the injury, clear up about how you exited Detroit and what your interests are, what your desires are from a football standpoint. Once he gets signed, I really don't care. The contract doesn't matter anymore. And you made this great point around Leonard Williams, right? I was what am I overly concerned about how much the Giants are spending? Now, everything happens in tandem. So what does it help or prevent you from being able to do? Certainly those are factors. Was I surprised by 72? Of course. But remember, last year he was offered a 4-year, $80 million extension from the Detroit Lions, and he turned that down. Now, it's a down year for the market, but he still wants to try to get back to something close to that number. And I think it'll be interesting to see going into next year where some of the biggest names end up being, because there are a handful of them like Devontae Adams, that maybe Allen Robinson will be back on the market. So what do those numbers look like, and where Golladay lands in that is probably going to reset him right where he should be in the 5 or 6 to 10, 12 range in terms of wide receivers that are getting paid. The other big piece out of this contract, though, as well, and I just want this to be a footnote before we get into, I want to touch on just what his impact is going to be for this team. This year's cap hit is a delicious $4.5 million. So we talked about this with Leonard Williams getting his deal done. I think it's the same thing here, right? Listen, okay, you want the bigger deal, you want the bigger contract. We want you here. Everybody loves it. We're all having a great time, right? Everyone's stroking each other's egos. Also, though, the best way to help us have you be here and have us be good while you're here is to find a way to make a very cap-friendly number this first year that's going to allow us still maybe to pursue another piece in free agency. We said around Leonard Williams, right? $11 million the first year. So you and I talked about you get around to 10 or something for Golladay. The fact that they got him down to this low of a first-year cap number is nothing short of impressive. And it also, I think, to your point, makes it a bit of a both sides thing that Kenny Golladay was willing to be that flexible around the number. You don't have to. And he chose to do it to help out the team so you feel like the buy-in is there.
The cap hit for Kenny Golladay is lower than the cap hit for Kyle Rudolph. Just think about that for a second. We went out and got Kenny Golladay, who everyone said was the number 1 wide receiver on the market. The Giants were desperate for a playmaker. If you watched any of Kenny Galladay's film, you'd see he's a guy that makes tough catches. And we need somebody that can go up in traffic, high point the ball, take it down, and move the chains. And that's what Kenny Golladay does. So from a contract perspective, everyone was laughing at Gettleman saying, we like to do contracts the old-fashioned way. 3 years, $10 million per year, that we don't like to change the money around. Well, guess what? Dave Gettleman is just trolling everyone when he's doing all this, because in the background, they're restructuring all these different contracts. They got Kyle Rudolph in. They signed John Ross to a low deal. They work cap magic with Kenny Golladay to the point where he's costing $4.5 million on the cap. He'll count towards about $23 million next year. But when the cap goes up 20 or 30%, that's going to look like a normal number, because there's going to be 3 or 4 other wide receivers to sign deals in the $22 to $24 million range. And all of a sudden he's back to, anywhere between 5th and 10th highest paid player, at the position.
Yeah, and I thought that was important too, because you see that 4.5, and then you wonder, what does it look like every other year? And it's basically balanced all the way through the last 3 years of the contract at 21 to 23 with signing bonuses and all that kind of little details there. So that's good. Before we do, and we're going to touch on Dave Gettleman and what he's done in this rebuild. Listen, don't listen to Dave. Essentially, just don't take Dave at his word or not at his word. Just wait to see until something happens and then judge him based on that. The reason why we're so excited about it, though, is it does give you the missing piece for this Giants offense. Briefly, before we get into the other news of the day, get Sterling Shepard back into his usual traditional position, then that benefits him as well. But Slayton, who is not a top 2 or top 3 round selection, he's a 5th round guy who's developed nicely for us. Now he should be able to have better opportunities when the defenses choose to focus on Kenny Golladay. So as we get Andy back in, what excites you the most? Is it Daniel Jones downfield? Is it Saquon Barkley having a clean box to play in when he gets the ball out of the backfield? Is it some of these secondary wide receivers? Does Sterling Shepard maybe more comfortably sitting in the slot with consistency excite you? What is the most tantalizing piece of this? Maybe beyond just the plays that we think and we expect Kenny Golladay to make.
We have playmakers now. Like, having Saquon hurt last year and having Golden Tate as our outside threat, it was maddening. It was frustrating. Yeah. I think the biggest thing for me is this year will be a true test of what we all think is that Daniel Jones is a franchise quarterback. We will find out this year because there's no excuses. We have the weapons all around him. Dave Gettleman has gone ahead and said, we need to improve this team. He goes and gets Golladay. He goes and gets John Ross. He goes out and gets Kyle Rudolph, a guy that hasn't dropped passes in years, right? Like multiple years have gone by since Kyle Rudolph has dropped a pass. So, he's addressed all of these challenges. They get a number 2 running back, even though some people feel that we overpaid for him. They have put all of these weapons around Daniel Jones. I really do think we're going to see him flourish this year, and that is the most exciting thing that I'm thinking about right now.
Yeah, and that's another piece of it that we'll get into in a minute in terms of how important this year is for not just, say, Dave Gettleman or say Saquon Barkley come back for injury or say Kenny Golladay coming off a hip injury, only playing 5 games. Like there's all these components about what's happened this offseason and what it could mean. Before we get to it, though, we have to touch on another element. The reason why keeping it at $4.5 million this year could be very important is because the Giants had another visit and another slumber party up there at we assume Dave Gettleman's house. We assume there's some type of insignia on a full. Would you say that Gettleman goes? Is he wearing like traditional pajamas, like old school pajamas with a button down in the pants, or is he going Johnny Rose style and wearing a full length nightshirt?
That's a great question. I really wonder what Gettleman's house looks like, and like. Is he watching like old country western movies in his TV den with like a scotch and a cigar? And he's like, "Hey, Adoree, why don't you come in for a minute? Why don't you sit down right over here next to old Davey?" And
I thought you were patting your knee, but that's okay. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Could you imagine? Come over here. Sit on my lap. Let me tell you a story.
Let's talk about sit down on old Grandpa Gettleman's lap. I feel like that's maybe where Gettleman is, but regardless of that. Because he has a welcoming home, apparently, and was able to get it done with Golladay. And by the way, and this feeds into what we're hearing now, Jabril Peppers and also Darnay Holmes were key in getting Kenny Golladay in the door, apparently. They were great sellers of that. Now we see over the weekend, Logan Ryan, as he tweeted out, just look who I ran into, runs into Adoree Jackson out there getting a bite to eat. So what do we think about the player potentially that we're getting in here, having the extra cap flexibility, 25-year-old, going to be 26 this season, coming off a knee injury last year, didn't play a ton, but this is regarded as on NFL.com, the 35th best available free agent on the market. That may seem like 35th. That's a big deal. There's a lot of positions and a lot of players that create that kind of collection of talent there. What do you see in Adoree Jackson and his fit for the Giants?
Well, 35th doesn't really matter to me what that number is because it's all about the Giants' needs, right? Like we don't. If there's a running back that's number 1 on the market, do we need a running back right now when we have Saquon Barkley? No, we don't care. We desperately need a number 2 cornerback to play on the other side of the field from James Bradberry. And guess what? Adoree Jackson is 25 years old. He is lightning fast. He is great at deflecting and defending passes. He had Pro Football Focus grades in the 70s until a knee injury last year really kind of sidelined and derailed his whole season. This is the dream scenario for the Giants. We're not talking about a 1-year rental on a 33-year-old guy that we're just hoping solidifies the roster. We're talking about talent that we could acquire to have on a multi-year deal that's going to be around as this young core on the defensive end starts to flourish.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense in that regard. We've talked about, you said you remember he was in Tennessee there, had Butler obviously across from him for stretches. At 25 years old, the regards for him from a scouting standpoint can be a little bit like, hit or miss. He can swing for the fences and make big plays. He can give up some big plays. But what I like about it is when you put him across from Bradberry, you assume, right, your exposure is less and your ability to capitalize on taking on some of those weaker matchup, quote unquote, weaker matchups should allow you to be that much more effective. So again, the thing that feels similar is Kenny Golladay, hip injury. Tell me about that. Let's clear everything up there and make sure you're good to go. What are you looking to accomplish? Same thing with Adoree Jackson, right? Like, hey, coming off a bit of a knee injury, what does that look like? How you feeling? What are you looking to accomplish? And to your point that you brought at the top about culture, it seems like maybe Logan Ryan was like the first kind of hint of this when they re-signed him last season, right? Where he wanted to be here. You heard a bit about the culture and what it meant to have the support of an organization around some personal issues that were going on for him. And now you're seeing him be involved in this recruiting process. He has, Adoree Jackson, that is, a visit scheduled with the Philadelphia Eagles tonight, following his visit with the Giants. Do you anticipate him making it to that visit, or do you think that the Giants are all but, and it's reported that he is very much the front runner, the Giants are the front runner, he wants to be there, etc. Do you think that this deal gets done before he gets to Philly?
He just started following late last night 6 Giant players on Instagram, like backup players, other players. Like he's starting to hit the like button. He's starting to get involved with the team. I think the Giants have to find a way to, they talk about not letting him leave the building and all that hyperbole, but the Giants do need to figure out a way to get a deal done with him before he goes to the Eagles, because we cannot have him going to Philadelphia and immediately becoming, a guy that's sitting across from Darius Slay. And now they have an amazing, cornerback room. I want to make a simple point that I see a bunch of Giant fans like, oh, he had a knee injury. He's got injury concerns. He gets burned a lot. He had a guy like Malcolm Butler on the other side of him. Kenny Golladay, oh, did we overpay? He doesn't play hard. He didn't play hard for the Lions. Can we just understand that, like, really good players don't hit the free agent market all that often because their teams re-sign them? Aaron Donald does not get out to the free agent market where we can just throw boatloads of cash at him and you're like, no real injury concerns, top 10 defensive player maybe of all time. Like, those things don't happen. So there are always going to be like 1 or 2 things that have caused their previous team to let them go or not sign them to a long-term contract. Like Kenny Golladay got offered, $20 million a year and he turned it down. And now we're complaining at $18 million. So there's always going to be question marks, but we just brought in talent that, Kenny Golladay led the league in touchdowns a year and a half ago. Right. Adoree Jackson was a 78 Pro Football Focus a year and a half ago. These are guys still in their 20s that haven't potentially even reached the pinnacle of their careers yet. I am so excited about bringing this type of talent into the room. But more importantly, to your point, Adam, there is a culture shift going on with the New York Football Giants that I haven't seen since those Justin Tuck, Osi Umenyiora years, where guys are buying into whatever Joe Judge is selling. And now the entire team is going after these free agents being like, you want to be a part of this. Like, you don't understand from the outside what's going on. We've got something really special here.
Yeah, and I think that's usually, money is a big needle mover. And I will say too, right? There's a couple of things I want to touch on here briefly. One is, yes, I think that you have seen that culture shift, and we're going to dive in a little bit deeper. But having players communicate to free agent prospects that, hey, this is a great place, you want to be a part of this, that moves the needle in a big way. The other little element to touch on is too, like Kenny Golladay, they said after the signing of the contract, when he said he heard Joe Judge's and Jason Garrett's vision for the offense, and that's what sold him. Listen, when you get Kenny Golladay, your plan's going to be, we're going to use you. We're going to
throw you the deep ball, right?
Right. Like, you know what I mean? So like that piece of it, I just go, yeah, well, of course, you know what I mean? Like, oh, their vision for the offense. I mean, you'd have to trip over your own, what, to really mess up selling the offense on it. Ultimately, it's a combination. He may be excited about it. He may like the prospect of it. Chicago is waiting in the wings, his hometown. They were going to up their offer in kind of the last little late hour, and that's why the Giants pushed to where they did. The money, right? Golladay wanted to get his market value as close to where he thought that it should have been before the down cap year as anything else. And then all these other pieces come in and it works out great. Hopefully the same thing for Adoree Jackson, who, by the way, on Spot Track is listed at $12.5 million a year. Now we can say maybe it shifts down a little bit because of the market, but you figure something in the 10 to 12 range. They have his market value at 4 years, basically $50 million. So it'll be interesting to see how those numbers play out if a deal gets done prior. To your point about the culture shift and change, this is an interesting one for me. You and I have gone back and forth about it. I've argued with pessimistic Mike. I have spent 3+ years defending Dave Gettleman in a lot of ways and in criticizing him when he needs it. But now here we are. And, whether or not Saquon Barkley at the number 2 pick is the right thing to do then, what else could you have accomplished? We could get into all that and there'd be justifiable criticisms. Here we are now. And potentially we're walking into a year with a number 1 wide receiver, a number 1 running back, our franchise quarterback, a number 1 cornerback, maybe a number 2 cornerback, right? Like all these pieces are adding up, and the combination of the draft and also free agency, maybe it took a year longer than fans wanted, but what has Gettleman accomplished here? Like where are we as we stand on the precipice of a really big draft class, I think, for the Giants as well? Like, check the boxes, right? You start to check off more and more boxes and realize what Dave Gettleman's been able to do, even if not in the most traditional methods or routes.
Okay, so there is a lot to unpack with Dave Gettleman. It's funny, like, Adam, what's the name of the general manager of the Green Bay Packers? Do you have any idea?
Bob Oblaw.
Okay. What about the GM for the, I don't know, pick another team. Like how many GMs do you actually know? And the reason why I'm saying this,
Herbie Hancock.
And how do you even know that? I don't know. That's weirdly strange that you know who the Chargers GM
Seattle
is.
Seahawks, Doris Day. I could name every single GM around the league.
Isn't John Schneider the GM of the Seattle Seahawks?
Neither here nor there. I used the character from Arrested Development. I talked about dead actors. Let's move on. Andy, the joke did not land.
Perfect. Anyways, the reason why I'm saying all this is because look at what everyone's like, oh, the Green Bay Packers, love to develop their own homegrown talent, and they're so good at drafting. And then look at what they did last year. They drafted a quarterback in the first round when they have an MVP, literally won the MVP quarterback on their roster who's won a Super Bowl, right? And then, like, what do? They go out in the second round and they draft a running back who's the backup running back, who's like the third running back on the roster. And then, oh, guess what? They just handed their starting running back a $12 million, annual contract to pay him as one of the highest paid running backs in the league. And he doesn't get criticized nearly as much as Dave Gettleman does for taking Saquon Barkley in the first round. Like it's unbelievable the perception we have. It must be nice to have 2 Hall of Fame quarterbacks back to back for 30 years, and it makes you look like you're a genius drafting, right? Like neither of the first 2 picks that the Packers had did anything of significance for the Packers, and they made it to the NFC Championship game. I say all this because Gettleman gets a bad break, and some of it is deservedly so, right? The DeAndre Baker thing did not work out. It didn't. But guess what? There are other moves that have been that Dave Gettleman has made, like trading Odell Beckham, that have worked out for the Giants. The Giants, from that draft pick, from trading Odell Beckham, the Giants got Dexter Lawrence, right? Like, let's not forget that Dexter Lawrence might be a top 10 player on the defensive side of the ball in the next couple of years. Like, that's how good. That's where his ceiling is. So as much as people like to pan Dave Gettleman for some of these moves, he has hit on quite a few of them. And if you look and we solidify someone like Adoree Jackson, I'd argue that the Giants secondary is top 3 in the league. Like, I don't think there's any other way around it.
That's where a lot of people are now talking about, right? Like, what would the impact of an Adoree Jackson adding him into that room when you say you have Logan Ryan and Jabril Peppers and Xavier McKinney and obviously another free agent acquisition in James Bradbury, right? Supplementing the acquisition and free agency by Dave Gettleman of Blake Martinez, right? So all of these things start to tumble into the factors here. Yeah, it will be very interesting in a division where the Washington football team brings in veteran quarterback there to try to solidify their offensive side of the ball. They get themselves Samuel in free agency as well. These are 2 teams that I think are going to be at the top of the division pecking order defensively, but being done in different ways, right? The front 7 for Washington is so dangerous, and you how are you going to protect your quarterback? You need to worry about that because it's going to help keep the pressure off of their secondary. We have talent up front, by the way, so it's not dismissing ours, but if you add in Adoree Jackson, you'd go, yeah, now what we're saying is, well, we're going to have our moments when we get after you. We're going to stuff that run still, even after losing Dalvin Tomlinson. And then when you do go to the secondary, we have some really playmakers around that area where you're going to say, you've been shut down by Bradbury here. Now go take a risky look over on the other side of the field and potentially have Xavier McKinney, Jabril Peppers, Logan Ryan flashing in support of an Adoree Jackson or whoever else may be lining up there.
Well, I think the other piece of this is not just about Gettleman. It has to be about Joe Judge. And,
Yep.
some of the press conferences where I mean, he just says all the right things. When he came out and said, we will never quit, like he gave that speech about how the Eagles just laid down, like folded like a lawn chair. He got everybody riled up. He was basically looking in the camera, talking to every Giant fan, and we all ate it up and loved it. But guess what? The players are buying into whatever Joe Judge is selling. Like, remember last offseason, Adam, when he took the names off the back of the jerseys and they were like, this is never going to work. He's ridiculous. This stinks. Now, a guy like Adoree Jackson, who's 25 years old, is coming up as a free agent, is sought out by every single team in the league. And guess what? His first visit to the New York Football Giants. Kenny Golladay, when he signs, he's like, I talked to Joe Judge, I'm in. I'm totally into what we're doing. We have Jabril Peppers, who only has 1 year left on his contract, going out and recruiting players, being like, we have something special here. And as much as we love Dave Gettleman for making the moves, if you don't have that culture where everyone's rowing in the boat together to be able to bring in these types of additions, it's never going to work. And I don't know what Joe Judge is selling right now, but everybody is buying it, especially me.
Well, yeah, and I mean, you have to make the case, right? Who hired Joe Judge, right? Who chose to bring in Joe Judge? You have to give that some of the level of that credit has to go to to Dave Gettleman, and maybe a little bit of it to John Mara even as well, a guy that we've belabored at times for maybe being too involved in what goes on around the organization. And that is important, though. You throw in a guy like Patrick Graham. Now the curiosity becomes about Jason Garrett on the offensive side and using all the talent that you're going to have here and making an explosive offense for Daniel Jones this year. Do you think that this is going to be the definitive year? There are some. We'll touch on this one thing before we get into draft priorities, because the culture has been shifted and it has been fantastic. Some reports have said still that the top two teams that should be interested in or considering or in the waters for a Russell Wilson, if the trades are still possible, are the Jets, and the Giants get thrown in there as well. Is there any world for you where what we've seen this offseason is indicative of that possibility as much as, proving what Daniel Jones is? Year number 3 for Daniel Jones. You and I love him and think he's the franchise quarterback. And this is how you set him up for the highest level of success and to confirm that he is your franchise quarterback. Any world where you buy into the speculation that, hey, maybe there's a package out there that the Giants could mortgage their future and throw in Daniel Jones, and all of a sudden we're staring down the barrel of Russell Wilson throwing the ball to Kenny Golladay?
Nope. I mean, look, is Russell Wilson today a better quarterback than Daniel Jones? Yes, he is. Clearly. Is he a Super Bowl champion? Yes, he is. Would I love to have Russell Wilson on the New York Giants? Of course. There is not a world in which it makes any sense to bring Russell Wilson in, making the money that he does, and then all this culture and all these players that we just acquired, like Jabril Peppers would have to be part of that trade, presumably, or Xavier McKinney would have to be part of that trade. We'd have to ship Daniel Jones. Like we'd have to give up more than 3 first-round picks. Like we would just decimate everything that we've built here. And the other piece of it is Gettleman went up and got Daniel Jones, right? Like he stood up and said, this is my guy. I don't care what everyone else says about who the right quarterback is for me to select. I'm taking Daniel Jones. Gettleman's success is tied to whether Daniel Jones gets a second contract from the New York Giants. And so, him trading away Daniel Jones and 4 first-round picks and Xavier McKinney and Jabril Peppers and Evan Ingram and 3 third-round picks is not going to be the way that we get any further to where we are. And that would be Gettleman admitting that he made a mistake in drafting Jones, and I just don't see that happening.
No, but I thought it was worth touching on. It's always fun to get into it. We'll close out of here on where the Giants need to look potentially as we approach the draft. A quick footnote, if you wonder about the future at the GM position, remember, Kevin Abrams is there. He's the assistant GM. He's also known as the numbers guy. He's the guy that takes care of the contracts. Whatever that means from a talent evaluation standpoint, you got to love what he did this offseason with these contracts, right? So he's figured out ways to make these numbers work. Dave Gettleman may be saying, I like it consistent. And then Kevin Abrams walks in the door and says, yeah, you might like it consistent, buddy, but we're not signing anybody that way. So we're going to have to go ahead and tweak these numbers. So tip of the cap to him. He may be the future of our GM position down the road at some point. turning our attention briefly over to the NFL draft, obviously, where do you still stand on offensive line as being the key priority at 11? There's some world where Slater is not going to be there. A lot of mocks have the Cowboys taking him in preparation for some of their older linemen. Do you still stand fast that offensive lineman is the way to go? If Slater isn't there, is there another lineman that you would take? Or, as some are saying, maybe the last little piece here is the edge rusher on the defensive side of the ball, the Rousseaus, the Kwity Payes of the world, that maybe the Giants need to look into investing in at that 11th pick to complete, quote unquote, their offseason.
I'm still on offensive lineman at 11. Like, it just feels like if we get Adoree Jackson, our glaring holes are at edge rusher and are at offensive line. And I think that 11 pick will allow us the luxury of getting one of those two addressed. I think, as you're seeing with some of the different free agent sightings on the defensive side of the ball, they're going to go with edge rusher by committee as of right now, where, you pay a guy like, Kyler Fackrell, $4 million. They're paying different guys a handful of dollars and hoping that they can find a way to get 3 sacks, 5 sacks, 7 sacks from just, a hodgepodge of different players. We did our mock offseason, what's a home run? And I said, sign Leonard Williams to his long-term deal. Unfortunately, let Dalvin Tomlinson go. Release Kevin Zeitler, restructure Nate Solder, and figure out how to get a wide receiver. And we've done all of that. In that offseason script, I had us early on going with offensive linemen at 11 over Waddle, Jamar Chase, Devonta Smith, because I just understand how important offensive linemen are. And the first name I came up with was Elijah Vera Tucker out of USC, who's now getting a little bit more traction with everyone thinking that Slater will be gone by 11. I stand by that. I think getting an offensive lineman, would you give Dave Gettleman an A+ or 100% grade on this offseason if we go get an offensive lineman at 11?
Yeah, no. Listen, I mean, I've been on that campaign as well. I think that for me, there's a difference between Sewell to maybe to Slater, obviously a little bit of a drop off there, and I also think that there is a drop off from Slater to anybody else, Vera Tucker or otherwise. So I might hesitate depending on who's there or who's not, and then just evaluating the edge rushing class as well. Maybe the absolute of 100% grade for Dave Gettleman would be managing to do the, trade down a handful of picks there from 11, still get your value at one of those two positions and add a little something extra so that you can just, flesh out some areas on your roster. And this is what you call getting greedy, friends. When you've had a nice off season and you're starting to get some big names in the door, you feel like you're an hour or two away from hearing Adoree Jackson's been signed. This is what you do. You start to dream a little dream where maybe Dave Gettleman can get extra value in the draft and then help solidify. Remember, we're not going to have the 5th round pick. So, there's still going to be some holes to fill here. And it'll be interesting to see. You'll know, right? I mean, you'll know if the Giants jump at taking a Kwity Paye or something, but it's interesting because some prospects are rising. Those edge rushers are just kind of sitting there, specifically around the 11th pick. They're just kind of hanging out in the world. So it's hard for me to get excited about one of them as opposed to a lineman.
Could you imagine Dave Gettleman trading back in the draft and talk about what is it? A zebra never changes his stripes. Like, Dave Gettleman always trades up and gives up assets to go get the guy he wants. Could you imagine this offseason if Dave Gettleman trades back to like 15 or 20, still gets an offensive lineman and picks up a 2nd round pick this year and a 3rd round pick next year? Like, what a home run that would be. That is like complete fantasy land for us. But I do believe that if we address offensive line or edge rusher at that 11 pick or early in the 2nd round, I think if we can kind of switch those back and forth, I'd feel really good about the Giants' chances to win the division for sure next year.
Well, listen, buddy, as you know, I started putting those shekels down pre Kenny Golladay signing. You got to see that, you got to see the writing on the wall and forecast what's to come. Listen, I'm starting to get a little more bullish about what their prospects will be going into the year. I think that there has been speculation around. You mentioned about Dave Gettleman, a guy that goes and gets his player, that the Giants, depending on how things shake out, maybe in the move up market, there was a mock draft scenario where Atlanta traded down twice, allowing Carolina to get their quarterback, and then at the 8th spot traded with the Giants so the Giants could go target. At the time, they had it labeled as Waddle because they needed the wide receiver. I could easily see it being Slater to get ahead of those couple of teams, Denver and Dallas, and maybe go get your guy. Depending on how you think the holes are on this roster and if this is the last missing piece, that could be what you want to go do or need to go do. I don't know if I love it because we only have so many picks in this draft. But, when you identify a position of need and then you identify the player that fills that need, I don't know what they're – same thing with Kenny Golladay, right? There's not a limit. $72 million. Yeah, okay, that's the guy that you want. Go get him, right? So I don't hold back on spending the money or spending the assets in that case to achieve what I want, finishing the offensive line. So it's going to be interesting, man. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, imagine on draft night, the Giants trade up to the 5 spot and draft Sewell to completely just lock in the offensive lineman of our dreams. And then is that the home run pick for Gettleman? Like, if you're going to trade up, shoot for the moon. You said Slater. Give me the number one transformative offensive lineman in this draft.
Well, there's a lot that goes into those type of moves. A little less expensive to move 3, moving up 8 picks or so. That can be a bit of a stretch. But hey, shoot the moon. Why not? We've accomplished a lot of those things along the way. Follow us on YouTube. Download, rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast wherever you get those fulfilled. 5-star reviews, if you please. We'll be back in a course throughout the week if Adoree Jackson